Lecture 18, Memory Encoding Processes. We turn our attention now to long-term memory, what James called secondary memory, or memory proper. What people really mean by memory, the permanent repository of knowledge stored in the mind. And the first thing to note is that this knowledge comes in a variety of forms. There are facts that you've learned, such as whether quartz is harder than granite, or when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. There's your knowledge of language, like the meanings of words and how to compose grammatical sentences. There are rules, like how to take the square root of a number, or what the best route is from the student union to the psychology building. And then there are your personal experiences, what you had for dinner last Friday night, what happened the last time you behaved irresponsibly, whatever. In answering all of these questions, we have to consult our memories, draw on the knowledge contained in memory. So knowledge is stored in memory, but there are lots of different kinds of knowledge, and that suggests that there might be different kinds of memory, even within the category of long-term memory. In fact, in cognitive psychology, we make a fundamental distinction between two types of knowledge stored in memory: declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge consists of factual statements such as, quartz is harder than granite, or Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. Knowledge of the meanings of words, and knowledge about personal experiences. These are all matters of fact. Procedural knowledge, by contrast, consists of directions for action, rules and skills, such as how to compose a grammatical sentence, how to solve for x in an algebraic equation, and how to tie a square knot. Declarative knowledge can be further classified into episodic and semantic memory, and procedural knowledge can be further classified into mental and behavioral procedures, and we'll talk about these subcategories in a moment. First, let's look at declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is factual knowledge concerning the nature of the world, in both its physical and social aspects. It includes knowledge about what words and numbers and other symbols mean, what attributes objects possess, what categories they belong to. It includes our knowledge of events and the context in which they take place. It includes all of our autobiographical memory. All declarative knowledge can be represented in what's called a propositional format. That is, as sentences having a subject and a verb and an object. So, for example, the word blunt means dull. The number 3 is less than the number 4. A red octagonal sign means you should stop. These are factual statements about the world, and they're all represented as sentence-like propositions in declarative memory. It's sometimes convenient to distinguish between perception-based and meaning-based representations in declarative memory. Perception-based representations often take the form of sensory images, and they preserve information about the physical structure of an event or object, what it looks like, or what it sounds like. Meaning-based representations often take the form of verbal descriptions, and they preserve information about the meaning and conceptual relations of an object or event. A meaning-based representation of a car is like a dictionary entry. It indicates that a car is a type of motor vehicle, but it doesn't tell you very much about what a car looks like. A perception-based representation is more like a Pictionary, which shows you what an object looks like. Procedural knowledge consists of the rules and skills that we use to manipulate and transform declarative knowledge. It includes the rules of mathematical and logical operations, the rules of grammar, inference, and judgment, the strategies to be used in forming percepts and encoding and retrieving memories, and it includes all sorts of motor skills. All procedural knowledge consists of directions for goal-directed action, and any piece of procedural knowledge can be represented in terms of what's known as a production. Productions have a kind of if-then format. They specify a goal and a condition under which some action will achieve a goal. So, if you want to drive a standard shift car, then you have to press down on the clutch. If you're pressing down on the clutch, then you put the car in first gear. If the car is in first gear, then you ease up on the clutch while pressing down on the accelerator, and that's how you get the car to move forward. So instead of being represented as single productions, a whole lot of procedural knowledge is represented as production systems, a whole set of if-then statements known as productions. If you want to tie a square knot, then you must first cross the two lines. If you've done that, then bring the ends together and cross them again. If you've done that, then make sure the ends are on the same side. If you've done that, then you're finished. Procedural knowledge comes in two basic forms. In motor procedures, the actions take the form of some kind of overt behavior that alters the publicly observable world, the objective world. The directions for operating a standard shift automobile are like that. Procedural knowledge tells you what to do with the clutch and the gear shift and the gas pedal. And if you do those things, the car moves forward and everyone can see it. In mental procedures, the actions take the form of a mental transformation. They don't alter the publicly observable world, but they do alter the person's private, internal mental representation of the world. Think about procedures for solving for x in an algebraic equation. If x plus 6 equals 38, then subtract 6 from both sides of the equation. If you've done that, then you know that x equals 32. And that's something that you know that you didn't know before. You've changed your knowledge, your subjective cognitive state, but you haven't changed the world outside any. We're not going to talk about procedural knowledge anymore in these lectures, though you will see examples of procedures in the next set of lectures on thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. In these lectures, we're going to focus on declarative knowledge. Within the domain of declarative knowledge, there's a further distinction to be made between episodic and semantic memory. Episodic memory is memory for specific events. It includes autobiographical memory because that's factual knowledge about your own personal experiences. But it can also include factual knowledge about other events as well. The key to episodic memory is that each episode recorded in memory is associated with a unique spatio-temporal context. Every event takes place at a particular time, in a particular place. And, as they say, two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. In terms of autobiographical memory, episodic memories also have self-reference. Your autobiographical memory is your knowledge about episodes that have happened to you and things that you've done. Semantic memory, by contrast, is much more abstract. It's a kind of mental dictionary or mental encyclopedia and contains a person's context-free knowledge about the world. Semantic memory doesn't make any reference to the episodic context in which it was acquired, and it really doesn't make much reference to the self as an actor or the experiencer of an event either. If I say that happy people smile, or parks have trees, or Saturday follows Friday, or automobiles have wheels, those are all factual statements, and they're, therefore, pieces of declarative knowledge. But they don't refer to me, and they don't refer to any particular event. They're just true. In the rest of these lectures, we're going to focus on episodic memory, or memory for specific events that we've experienced at particular times and in particular places. but we will also talk about semantic memory. First, when we talk about concepts and categories in the lectures on thinking, and later on when we talk about the meanings of words in the lectures on language. For now, let me just say a couple of things about the relations among these various forms of memory. First, it appears that most knowledge comes from experience, and therefore most semantic knowledge starts out having a kind of episodic character. When you learn some new fact, you often remember where and when you learned it. However, as similar episodes accumulate, the contextual features of the individual episodic memories are lost, or maybe they blur together, resulting in a fragment of generalized, abstract, semantic memory. Later in these lectures, I'll also make the point that the formation of an episodic memory depends on the existence of a pre-existing fund of semantic knowledge, which allows us to identify and categorize and understand the things we're experiencing and the things that we're doing. So semantic memories start out as episodic memories, and episodic memories draw on semantic memories. Finally, it's important to note that memory itself is a skilled activity. Thus, the encoding and storage and retrieval of declarative memories depends on procedural knowledge, the knowledge that we have about how to put our faculty of memory to use. If you want to remember something well, then you've got to do certain kinds of things. Our knowledge of those things that we do to remember things well, that's part of our procedural memory. So far as episodic memory is concerned, the question at hand is, how do we remember the things we remember, and why do we forget the things we forget? We can understand the causes of remembering and forgetting in terms of 3 stages of memory processing: encoding, storage, and retrieval. In encoding, we create a record of some event, which leaves a representation of that event in memory. That's known as a memory trace. And the general idea is that all perceptual activity leaves some representation of the percept in memory. In storage, the newly encoded memory trace is retained over time in some latent state, so that it's available later on for use. And in retrieval, a stored memory trace is recovered, so that it can be used in some kind of cognitive task. We encode episodic knowledge in memory. It stays there in storage until it's retrieved and accessed for some kind of use. Remembering some past event obviously depends on success at all 3 of these stages. You've got to encode a trace of the event in the first place. It's got to stay in storage, and you've got to get it out of storage. But forgetting can involve a failure in any of these stages, either alone or in combination. An event can be forgotten because a trace of that event was never encoded in the first place, or because it was lost from storage, or because the stored trace for some reason can't be retrieved. Sometimes the trace has been encoded, but the way it's been encoded makes it difficult to retrieve. Sometimes the condition of retrieval can compensate for a poor encoding. We'll see how all this works out in what follows. Unfortunately, when it comes to autobiographical memory, which is what we're really interested in, we don't always have knowledge or control over these 3 stages. For that reason, laboratory studies of memory usually make use of what's known as the verbal learning paradigm, which initially looks kind of artificial, but turns out to be a very good laboratory model for autobiographical memory in the real world. In the verbal learning paradigm, the subject's task is to memorize 1 or more lists of familiar words. The fact that the words are already known to the subject makes this an experiment in episodic memory, not semantic memory. The subject doesn't have to learn the meanings of new words. He or she just has to remember where and when certain words were presented. There are lots of variants on this basic paradigm. The subject might study words or pictures, sentences or paragraphs, slide sequences or film clips. The subject might be asked to remember odors or tastes or sequences of tones. The precise stimulus materials used don't really matter. The important point is that each list and each item on the list comprises a unique event that occurs in a unique spatio-temporal context. Each list and each item on the list is an episodic memory. If we're particularly interested in studying the processes of encoding a new memory, we would do something to vary the conditions of encoding. One group of subjects might study the list just once. Another group might study the list 5 times. One group might get a slow rate of presentation. Another group might get a quick rate of presentation. We might present one group with the list orally and another group with the list visually. In each case, we'd be varying the conditions of encoding. Once the list has been presented, then we let some period of time elapse before we test the subject's memory. It might be a long interval or a short interval. The subject might be allowed to rehearse the item silently to himself, or he might be engaged in some kind of task that would distract him from the list. Remember, in the last lecture, we defined long-term memory as whatever is remembered after about 30 seconds of distraction. Then, after the retention interval, we ask the subject to report what he remembers. We could test the subject's recall of the list simply by asking him what were the items on the list. Or we could employ a recognition test similar to a multiple choice test, in which we present the subject with a long list of words, some of which were presented, others which were not, and ask him to tell us which were which. So using the verbal learning paradigm, construing the items on the list as specific episodes, we can vary the conditions of encoding, storage, and retrieval to find out why we remember what we remember and why we forget what we forget. Let me give you an idea about how this works. In a moment, I'm going to read you a list of familiar words. What I want you to do is to listen to each one as I read it. After I've read the entire list, I'm going to give you a 3-digit number. And what I want you to do is subtract 7 from that number, take that result, and subtract 7 from that result, then 7 again from that result, until I tell you to stop. Ready? Now go to the next slide. Anger, bread, cold, foot, girl, king, mountain, needle, rough, slow, spider, thief, 763, 756, 749, 742, 735. Keep going until I tell you to stop. Okay, stop. Now write down the words that you remember. Okay, now write down the names of any animals that you remember. In fact, there were some animal names. Was one of the words spider, or was it snake? Okay, now check your memory by moving to the next slide. Okay, so there's the list. 12 items. That's more than the capacity of short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2. And I asked you to perform a distractor task known as serial sevens, subtracting 7 and 7 and 7 again for a period of about 30 seconds. So that's a retention interval that makes it long-term memory. There was, in fact, an animal name, and it was spider, not snake. So that's how we use this basic verbal learning paradigm to study memory. Each list that you might be presented with, and each word on the list, represents a discrete episode of experience, an event that occurred at a particular place and a particular time. We vary the conditions at one or more stages of processing, either encoding or storage or retrieval, and then we observe the effects of these experimental manipulations on the subject's ability to remember the items on the list correctly in response to one or another kind of query or question. So now, with this basic tool in hand, let's look at some of the principles that govern the encoding phase of memory processing. Let's assume that a subject has just experienced an event, that is, studied a list. How does the mental representation of that event get stored in memory? That's the basic question for the encoding phase. And what are the consequences for how an event is encoded, for how it will be remembered later on? Traditionally, the encoding phase of memory processing has been characterized in terms of rehearsal. Memory has been construed as a byproduct of perception, and the idea is that the more that the item has been rehearsed, the better will be our memory for it. Later on, in classic associationistic learning theories, like the stimulus-response theory of learning, memories were construed as associations that are stamped in the mind by means of repetition. You'll recall from the learning lectures Thorndike's law of exercise, which basically says that stimulus-response associations are strengthened by use and weakened by disuse. In the very first experimental studies of memory, the German psychologist Hermann von Ebbinghaus formulated this principle of rehearsal in terms of what he called the law of repetition, which basically says that retention is a function of the number of times the item has been repeated. Ebbinghaus virtually invented the verbal learning procedure as a paradigm for studying memory. But he didn't use words. He used nonsense syllables, strings of letters, a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant, so you could pronounce them, which he arranged in lists. And then Ebbinghaus asked his subjects to memorize these lists of nonsense syllables in strict serial order. So you might get a list that says dag, gex, mub, kev, wall, and then have to repeat that back. Ebbinghaus used nonsense syllables instead of words because he wanted to study what he considered to be pure memory, memories that occurred without any pre-existing associations. He was really interested in the principle of association by contiguity, which was the big principle of association back in the 19th century, and he didn't want any extra experimental associations mucking up his experiment. So the idea is that by arranging these nonsense syllables into a list, each nonsense syllable, each CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant, would serve as a stimulus for the next one in the list. And each CVC in the list would be a response to the previous one in the list. In one of his experiments, Ebbinghaus varied the number of times he presented the list for study to his subjects. Some lists were presented just once. Others were repeated several times. Then he let a standard retention interval elapse of 24 hours, and then he presented the list again and asked the subject to memorize it again to a criterion of 1 or 2 perfect repetitions. Savings in relearning, that is, the amount of time it took the subjects in the various conditions to relearn the list after the retention interval, that was his measure of memory. We've talked about this type of savings in relearning before in the context of classical conditioning, and in fact, Ebbinghaus invented this measure of memory as well as the nonsense syllable. He was really quite some guy, and I should point out that he served as the subject for his own experiments. So every day he'd sit down and memorize a bunch of lists of nonsense syllables and test his memory for a bunch of lists of nonsense syllables he had memorized the previous day. And here's a graph that portrays Ebbinghaus's actual results. Here we have a standard list of 16 nonsense syllables, which Ebbinghaus repeated from 8 to 64 times. And then there are control lists which he didn't study at all. So these are the lists with 0 repetitions. Then, after a retention interval of 24 hours, he measured the time it took him to relearn each list to a criterion of 1 perfect repetition. Obviously, it took him longer to learn the list if he had never seen it before. But the relearning time was systematically related to the number of times that the list had been repeated the day before. With 8 repetitions, it took him a fairly long time to relearn the list. With 64 repetitions, a lot less. So the more repetitions during the study phase, the encoding phase, the less time was needed to learn the list at the test phase, the retrieval phase. Thus, Ebbinghaus inferred that memory strength increases with rehearsal. Memory strength increases with repetition. That's the law of repetition. Now, Ebbinghaus's findings were consistent with the prevailing theory about associations at the time, but it's now clear that encoding is not merely a function of repetition or rehearsal. Consider a more recent experiment by Craik and Watkins at the University of Toronto. Craik and Watkins presented subjects with a list of familiar words, one at a time. Each item was presented at a regular interval, and instead of just listening to the list, the subject was given a task which was to detect any word that met a particular criterion. For example, to detect any word that began with the letter P, and to be able to report on demand the most recent word that met that criterion. Whenever a new P word appeared, they could forget the previous one, and they could also forget all the intervening words that did not begin with the letter P. Craik and Watkins also varied the number of non-critical items, that is, items that did not begin with the letter P, between the critical items that did begin with the letter P. Thus, in effect, they varied the amount of rehearsal devoted to each target P word. After going through the entire list, the subjects were surprised with a recall test in which they were asked to remember all the critical words on the list, in this case, all the words that began with the letter P. Here's a concrete example to make the Craik and Watkins procedure clearer. I've got a list of words, some of which begin with the critical letter P. So the first word on the list is peas. It begins with P, and the subject has to remember that. Next word is chair. The subject can ignore that. Next word is potato. The subject can now get rid of the word peas, forget the word peas, and has to remember the word potato. Book, egg, cat, window, punt. A new word beginning with P. Forget potato, remember punt. Radio, music, spiral, position. Forget punt, pick up position. Bell, parking. Forget position, pick up parking. So peas gets rehearsed for 1 item's worth, potato for 4 items worth, punt 3 items worth, position 1 item's worth, and parking, well, no rehearsal at all. And to see what the effect of varying the amount of rehearsal is on memory for these critical words. In a word, nothing. This figure shows the percentage of subjects recalling an item as a function of the number of repetitions received by each item during the study phase, the encoding phase of the experiment. By the way, recall for the non-critical items was very poor, which is not surprising. No rehearsal, no memory. However, the recall for the critical targets was also relatively poor, even though each critical word had received some rehearsal. Most important, there was no correlation at all between recall and the amount of rehearsal each item had received. If an item received just one repetition, it was recalled about 16% of the time. If an item received 12 repetitions, it was recalled about 19% of the time. Not a big difference. Overall, there was just no relation between repetition and memory. Based on results like these, Craik and Watkins argued that there are actually two different kinds of rehearsal. There's a big difference between maintenance rehearsal, or rote repetition, and what they called elaborative rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal simply maintains traces in an active state, in something like short-term memory or working memory, whereas elaborative rehearsal links new items to pre-existing knowledge stored in long-term memory, and is really what's important in laying down a lasting memory trace. Rote rehearsal may be fine for remembering a telephone number when you're trying to get from the phone book to the telephone, but in their view, memories are only permanently stored if they're subject to some degree of elaboration. Let me give you a personal example. I used to teach at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I worked with a travel agency known as Gulliver's Travels, which still exists in Madison. And when I hooked up with my travel agent, he said to me, "Well, you'll always remember my telephone number. It's 256-4444. 256 is 4 raised to the 4th power, 4 to the power of 4, which of course it is." Doug, his name was Doug, linked his telephone number to something that I knew out of my knowledge of mathematics. I haven't lived in Madison in more than 20 years, and I haven't seen or talked to Doug in more than 20 years. But I still remember that telephone number. That's what elaborative rehearsal can get you. The importance of elaborative rehearsal is illustrated by experiments performed by Craik and his colleagues on what is known as the depth of processing paradigm in the study of memory. In depth of processing experiments, subjects are presented with a list of words, one at a time, and they're asked to perform one of 4 kinds of orienting tasks. In a structural or orthographic task, they're asked to make some judgment about the physical characteristics of the printed word. For example, whether it's printed in upper or lower case, or in a particular color, whether it contains a particular letter, or they're asked to count the number of vertical lines or horizontal lines that are in the word. Orthographic tasks focus the subject's attention on what the word looks like. In a phonemic or acoustic task, they're asked to make some judgment about what the word sounds like. For example, whether it rhymes with some other word. In a semantic task, subjects are asked to make a judgment about the meaning of a word, whether it means something similar to some other word, or is somehow associated with it, or whether it belongs in a particular category. And in a sentence task, they are asked to judge whether the word makes sense in a particular sentence frame, a judgment that is based on knowledge of grammar as well as knowledge of meaning. So subjects are presented with a number of words. For some words, they made a structural judgment. For other words, they made a phonemic judgment. For other words, they made a semantic judgment, and for other words, they made a sentence judgment. The exact tasks vary from experiment to experiment, but you get the idea. Note that in this experiment, the subjects aren't actually asked to memorize anything. They're simply asked to make some judgments about the words. And each of the words is presented just once. There's just one study trial, one encounter with the word. Nevertheless, at the end of the experiment, the subjects were surprised with a request to remember the words that they had made judgments about. The typical finding of a depth of processing experiment is that memory is very poor for words that are subject to orthographic or phonemic judgments compared to semantic or sentence judgments. If subjects make a judgment about the appearance of the word, what it looks like or what it sounds like, memory is relatively poor. But if subjects make a judgment about the meaning of the word or how it fits in a particular sentence, memory is very good indeed. This effect became known as the depth of processing effect. In Craig's interpretation, each of these orienting tasks requires a different kind of processing at the time of encoding. The orthographic and phonemic tasks require only shallow processing, not much processing at all, while the semantic and sentence tasks require deeper processing. And the idea here is that the deeper the processing, the better the memory. Studies like this illustrate what we now think of as the elaboration principle in memory. Memory for an event is a function of the extent to which that event is analyzed and related to pre-existing knowledge at the time of encoding. We can define elaboration in a number of ways. First, simply in terms of the sheer amount of attention that's paid to the event, or the number of attributes or features of the event that are processed at the time of perception, or the number of links formed between the event and other pre-existing pieces of knowledge. The more attention we pay, the deeper we process the event. The more we elaborate the event with respect to things we already know, the better the memory. So now we understand that there are at least two different modes of processing at the time of encoding, two ways in which we can encode a trace in memory. Rote maintenance rehearsal, in which we mentally repeat an event over and over again without adding to it, maintains an item in immediate memory, short-term memory, working memory, but does not create a particularly long-lasting trace. Creating a long-lasting memory trace requires that we add something to the trace at the time of encoding. And this process of adding something to the trace is what goes on in elaborative rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal adds something to the trace by connecting a new event, this new memory, up to things that we already know. This added value is critical to creating a long-lasting memory trace. It turns out that elaborative processing is absolutely critical to memory and encoding. But elaboration isn't the only process that's important for encoding. The elaboration principle applies to individual list items, and what it basically says is that retention is improved if we connect individual list items to previous knowledge, to something we already know. But retention is also improved if we connect individual list items to each other, if we establish links between individual list items. Evidence for this idea comes from studies of organizational activity in memory, in which we compare the order in which subjects remember words to the order in which those words were originally presented to them. And when we do that, what we usually find is that subjects reorganize the list. They reorder the items, grouping them together in various ways. So, for example, if we ask subjects to study this list, give them a distraction interval, and then ask them to remember the items in the list, they probably won't remember the items in the order in which they were presented. Rather, they'll probably group the body parts together, foot, finger, and mouth, and the animals, lion, elephant, rat, and the articles of clothing, blouse, coat, and tie, and the colors, orange, amber, and purple. The subjects will reorganize the list to put items that belong in the same category together. This is a phenomenon known as category clustering, grouping items according to shared category membership. Here's a classic experiment by Bousfield and Cohen that shows how category clustering is related to recall. In this study, the subjects were given several different recall trials. They studied the list, recalled it, studied the list again, recalled it again, studied the list again, and recalled it again. Obviously, memory improved over trials, but what's important is that the degree of category clustering also increased over these repeated study test cycles. The more subjects clustered their items together by category membership, the better they were able to remember the items. Organization in recall doesn't have to be based on category membership. If subjects study a list like this one, especially over repeated study test cycles, they'll tend to recall together those items that are associatively related. Boy, girl, black, white, table, chair, long, short, eagle, bird, flowers, blossom. Here, the organization of the list isn't based exactly on category membership, but rather is based on pre-existing word associations that people have. If I give you the word boy and ask you to give me the first word that you think of, you'll almost certainly say girl. If I say table, you'll almost certainly say chair. Reorganizing lists in this way helps us to remember the items in the list. Category clustering and associative clustering are forms of organization that capitalize on organization that's built into the list by the experimenter. But subjects can show organizational activity that helps recall even when there are no categorical or associative relationships built into the list at all. This was discovered by Tulving in the phenomenon of subjective organization. In a list like this, iron, table, dog, pepper, blue, window, boy, stars, no two items belong to the same conceptual category, so there's no basis for category clustering. And no two items are associatively related to each other either, so there's no basis for associative clustering. Yet over multiple test trials, individual subjects will organize this material, reorganize it, so that they can recall the items effectively. But each subject will organize the items in a somewhat different way. Often, this organization takes the form of a story or an image. So, for example, you might have an image of a boy sitting at a table with a dog at his feet. There's a pepper shaker on the table. He's looking out a window through iron bars at the stars in the blue night sky. Somebody else might conjure up some other image. It doesn't really matter what the image is or what the story is, so long as it links all the items together. To the extent that you can do this, impose some subjective organization on the material, you'll remember it better. So, the phenomena of category clustering, associative clustering, and subjective organization illustrate the organization principle in memory, which is that memory for an event is a function of the extent to which that event is related to other events at the time of encoding. If you've got a bunch of things to remember, you'll remember them better if you try to link each of them to at least some of the others. The organization principle may seem like just a special case of the elaboration principle, but they're really very different. The elaboration principle refers to single item processing, or item-specific processing, in which individual items are related to pre-existing knowledge. But organization refers to relational, or inter-item processing, by which individual list items are related to each other. Both elaboration and organization reflect cognitive activity on the part of the subject, what a British psychologist, Frederick C. Bartlett, called effort after meaning. The more effort, the better the memory. The more meaning, the better the memory. Even with Ebbinghaus's nonsense syllables, which are intentionally stripped of all meaning, subjects try to give the nonsense syllables meaning, try to relate them to words that they already know. To the extent to which subjects do that, they remember nonsense syllables better than if they don't. In both elaboration and organization, we are trying to make sense of the item, relate it to what we already know. In elaboration, we relate individual new items to what we already know. In organization, we relate new items to each other. So now we have three ways to process an item at the time of encoding. First, rote or maintenance rehearsal, which maintains individual items in a highly active state, makes them highly accessible in short-term or working memory, but doesn't have much effect on their status in long-term memory. Elaboration, which connects individual items to pieces of pre-existing knowledge. And organization, which connects individual items to each other. Elaboration and organization are critical to long-term memory. The more elaboration, the more organization at the time of encoding, the better the memory at the time of retrieval.